They expected you to break, to chase, to explain, to beg. But what they never expected was silence. There's a moment, quiet but defining, when you finally stop trying to be understood by someone who only listens to their ego. You stop answering, stop justifying, stop bleeding emotionally for someone who was never truly paying attention. That moment is not weakness. It's not a retreat. It's the beginning of power. Silence isn't empty. It's full of every boundary you were too afraid to set. It's your peace reclaiming space from someone who only showed up for the chaos. And the truth is, the loudest message you'll ever send doesn't need to be spoken at all. When you disappear without explanation, when you withdraw your energy with no drama, no goodbye, no need for revenge, they don't get closure. They get confused, and eventually, they get the mirror. That's when the ego begins to unravel. In this video, we're going deep into how silence becomes your strength, your protection, your quiet revenge, and why the absence of your voice can echo louder than any argument ever could. If this already speaks to something inside you, subscribe now. Join a space where your growth doesn't need to be shouted to be seen. And in the comments, share this truth with me. Have you ever chosen silence? And did it change everything? Let's begin. 1. Stop feeding their ego. Starve it with silence. You don't need to scream, block, or slam doors to reclaim your peace. Sometimes all it takes is stillness, a glance, a pause, a quiet refusal to play the same emotional game again. There are people in your life who only stick around because you keep offering them something they feed on, not your love, not your loyalty, but your reaction. The more you react, the more relevant they feel. The more you explain yourself, the more power they believe they hold. They provoke, not to connect, but to control. And each time you respond, even in frustration, even in defense, you keep that ego well fed. What happens when you stop? What happens when you say nothing at all? Imagine someone at a family dinner, your cousin maybe, throwing yet another passive-aggressive comment at you across the table. Everyone hears it, but they also look at you, expecting the usual comeback, the usual tension. But this time, you don't flinch. You take a sip of your drink, you laugh at someone else's joke, you let the comment fall flat, untouched by your energy. And the silence that follows is louder than any insult. It makes people shift in their seats, because the performance didn't get the audience it was hoping for. You didn't feed the need for control, for attention, for chaos. And that is the beginning of a different kind of power. The kind that unnerves without saying a word. Silence isn't passive, it's intentional. It's the art of emotional detachment without bitterness. It says, I'm no longer available to be manipulated. And more importantly, it whispers to the other person's ego, you're not as important as you thought. That truth is brutal, but it's also liberating. The person who relies on your reactions cannot survive your stillness, because the one thing the ego cannot endure is indifference. At first, they might think you're playing games. They'll wait for the paragraph-long messages you used to send. They'll expect you to circle back like always, apologizing for something you didn't do just to keep the peace. But when the messages don't come, when the silence stretches into days and then weeks, they begin to hear something different. The sound of their own behavior echoing back at them, unsoftened by your emotional labor. And it rattles them. Because silence isn't distance. It's rejection without saying no. It's your quiet refusal to keep bleeding for someone who is never willing to stop cutting. That's what makes silence so powerful. It's not the absence of sound, it's the presence of self-respect. When you finally stop feeding their ego, you start feeding your own soul. You stop explaining your worth and start embodying it. You stop reacting emotionally and start responding spiritually, with clarity, with calm, with emotional detachment. And they notice. Oh, they notice. The absence of drama becomes deafening for those addicted to it. You'll see it in the way they check your online activity, or suddenly text you something vague like, hope you're good, hoping to bait you into a conversation you don't owe them. You'll hear it in the silence that follows your silence. The discomfort that creeps in when they no longer know where they stand with you. Because silence removes the illusion of control. It doesn't just starve their ego, it exposes it. And exposure is painful when the mirror is clear. When you choose to go silent, not out of spite but out of growth, you shift everything. You stop reacting to disrespect. You stop engaging with ego-driven drama. You stop offering explanations to people committed to misunderstanding you. Instead, you build emotional independence. You take back your energy. You practice emotional detachment, not as avoidance, but as strength. And in doing so, you give them nothing to fight, nothing to twist, nothing to feed on. This is not about being cold. It's about being clear. It's about realizing that not every attack needs a defense, not every insult needs a reply, and not every person deserves access to your emotional life. When you fall silent, you don't disappear. You become more visible than ever. Because now, every word you don't say forces them to reckon with the consequences of their own actions. No validation, no explanation, just absence, just peace. And that silence? It hurts more than anything you could have said. Because while they expected noise, you gave them nothing. While they braced for fire, you offered air. And while they thought they had control, you walked away completely free. You chose yourself. And that, more than any argument, any closure, any final word, is what finally destroys the ego they built on your reaction. 2. Break the cycle. Don't show up for the drama. You know the pattern. They vanish, then return when their world falls apart. They don't check on you. They don't ask how you've been. They show up with chaos in one hand and expectation in the other. Every time they need an audience for their emotional storm, they call you. And every time you pick up, you offer comfort, you offer logic, you offer energy. But this time, something inside you pauses. You see the name flash on your screen. You take a breath, and for the first time, you do nothing. No reply, no explanation, just stillness. You choose not to enter the storm. Not because you don't care, but because you finally do. You care enough about your peace not to offer it up as a sacrifice for someone else's mess. People who thrive on emotional drama will always find a reason to come back. But what they want isn't a connection, it's validation, it's attention. They want you to keep playing the role they've assigned you, the fixer, the listener, the one who always says, "It's okay, I'm here." But when you stop showing up, the entire production falls apart. The scene doesn't work without your part. The tension loses its grip without your response. They call it cold, they call it distant, but deep down they know it's a boundary, a quiet one, a clear one, and it terrifies them because silence breaks cycles faster than confrontation ever could. When you refuse to perform, the script ends, and they are left facing something they never planned for, themselves. That's the thing about emotional manipulation. It depends on your participation. The guilt tripping, the gaslighting, the endless monologues about how everyone else has wronged them, all of it needs your reaction. But when you choose emotional detachment, when you calmly withdraw, instead of defending or rescuing, you dismantle their power. And they feel it. This isn't about ghosting or holding grudges. It's about clarity. It's about recognizing that some people aren't looking for resolution. They're looking for reaction. They don't want to fix things. They want to repeat things. They want your energy without ever giving theirs. But your silence tells a different story. It says, "I no longer have room for this loop. I'm not available for your drama. I've outgrown the role you need me to play." It's not always easy. There will be a voice inside you that whispers, "Just reply. Just be kind. Just one more time." Especially if it's someone you've known for years, someone you once loved deeply. But there comes a point where kindness to them becomes cruelty to yourself. There comes a moment where showing up means shrinking again, abandoning your peace to rescue someone who keeps setting fires just to see if you'll run in. That's when you choose silence, not to hurt them, not to win, but to heal. You go for a walk, you drink water, you write your feelings in a journal instead of sending them in a text. You respond to the pull with stillness. And in that silence, you begin to hear something far more honest than their drama. Your own voice, rising again, no longer drowned in someone else's storm. You'll feel guilty. You'll feel the ache of old habits trying to pull you back. But stay still, because something powerful happens when you don't show up. The performance ends, the ego shrinks, the illusion of control fades, and maybe, just maybe, they'll finally feel the weight of the space you used to fill. That's not your punishment, that's their reflection. And that's how change begins. Your peace is not a tool to fix someone else's dysfunction. Your silence is not cruelty. It's wisdom. It's the decision to stop dancing with chaos and start walking toward emotional independence. Every time you choose not to engage, not to explain, not to be pulled back into the same cycle, you are rewriting your story. You are choosing your healing over their comfort. And if they finally look around and realize you're no longer on stage, that the show doesn't go on without you, let it be a wake-up call. When you never had to deliver in words, let it echo in the silence you chose. Because when you don't show up for the drama, you show up for yourself. And that changes everything. 3. Let them drown in the questions you never answer. There's a particular kind of silence that doesn't echo. It suffocates. It doesn't just fall into the room. It settles in someone's mind like smoke. Impossible to grab, impossible to ignore. And for the kind of person who thrives on control, that silence is unbearable. Because silence means you no longer need them to understand. You no longer feel the urge to explain. You're not angry, you're done. And that is something their ego cannot process. The human mind craves closure, but the ego demands certainty. So when you choose stillness over explanation, calm over confrontation, they are left alone with the only voice they can't escape, their own. Imagine this: every week in team meetings, a coworker throws subtle jokes at your expense. You always laugh it off, try to smooth the air, maybe even defend yourself once in a while, hoping they'll back off. But they don't, because your reaction, no matter how polite, was always fuel. It made them feel powerful, clever, and superior. Until one day, you pause. You don't laugh, you don't respond, you don't make eye contact. You simply turn back to your laptop, calm, composed, present, but completely unavailable. And suddenly the room feels colder, not because you made a scene, but because you didn't. You broke the loop not with words, but with your absence. And the ego across from you, once so loud, begins to feel its own emptiness. You see, when you stop reacting, you stop giving. And for people who crave emotional power, nothing is more unsettling than your emotional detachment. It's not rejection. They know how to handle rejection. It's not anger. They expect that. What they don't know how to process is your indifference. They search your face for clues, watch your posture, replay old conversations, trying to decode the meaning behind your silence. They invent reasons, build theories, and ask mutual friends if something happened. But nothing happened. You just stopped explaining yourself to people who never really listened. You stopped defending your worth to those who only paid attention when it served their pride. And now they're alone with questions. Questions like, did I push too far? Did they finally get tired of me? Why aren't they reacting? These aren't just thoughts, they're mini ego deaths. Because the truth is, their identity depended on your reaction. It gave them something to push against, something to feel superior to. Without that, they're floating in the unknown. And egos hate the unknown. In silence, they begin to realize they might not be as important to you as they assumed. And that realization stings far more than any insult ever could. Choosing silence isn't about ghosting or cruelty. It's emotional discipline. It's choosing to stop feeding cycles that drain your energy. It's letting people experience the consequences of their actions without shielding them from discomfort. It's allowing space for accountability to bloom, not through blame, but through absence. Because when someone sits alone in the space you used to fill, they're forced to confront the truth that was always there. They were never entitled to your presence, your patience, or your peace. You don't owe anyone an explanation for your boundaries. Not when they've repeatedly proven they don't value your voice. Your silence isn't punishment. It's a reminder that your emotional well-being matters more than their temporary confusion. And if that silence keeps them awake at night, checking your profile, reading your old texts, searching for meaning where there is none, it's not because you're cruel. It's because they finally have to hear themselves without your energy drowning out their inner chaos. There's power in stillness, a kind of emotional detachment that doesn't scream, "I'm over it." It simply lives with it. You show up for your life with calm clarity, with a mind no longer clouded by the need for closure or validation. And in doing so, you stop being a participant in their emotional performance. You exit the scene, not with fire, but with peace. Not with final words, but with quiet distance. And from that distance, they begin to understand something they never expected. The loudest message you ever sent was the one you never said. Silence, in this context, becomes more than absence. It becomes a statement of self-respect, a reclaiming of energy, and a breaking of patterns. Let them sit with the questions, let them wonder. Because when the noise stops, the truth finally has room to speak. And this time, it's not your voice they hear, it's their own. 4. Evolve without announcement. Let silence speak for you. Sometimes the most powerful changes don't come with fireworks. They arrive quietly, without a word, without warning, without the need to be seen. One day, you simply stop explaining. Not because you've run out of things to say, but because the version of you that needed to be understood no longer exists. This kind of growth doesn't scream, it doesn't demand recognition, it just lives. And in that silence, something remarkable happens. The people who once assumed they knew you start to realize they've lost access to someone they never truly saw in the first place. You might remember a friend who always had something to say about your life choices. Maybe they teased you for your career path, or made casual remarks about how you spent your weekends. At the time, you brushed it off, laughed along, maybe even internalized a bit of it, just to avoid conflict. But now, you're in a different place. You've been waking up earlier, going to the gym, writing your thoughts down in a journal before the rest of the world opens its eyes. You're eating better, reading again. You're choosing quiet things, sustainable things, that make your mind clearer and your heart lighter. And then one day, that friend sends you a message. Hey, haven't heard from you. Everything okay? The old you would have answered immediately. Explained. Assured. Offered proof that you're doing fine. But the version of you now doesn't feel the need. You don't ghost them. You're not angry. You've just shifted into a space where your growth is no longer up for discussion. The truth is, when you evolve in silence, you allow others to project their own meaning onto your distance. Some will take it as rejection, some as arrogance, some as a weakness, but their interpretation says more about their ego than about your evolution. Silence, in this sense, becomes a mirror. It reflects exactly where they stood in your life, not where you stood in theirs. And that shift is jarring for anyone who relied on the old version of you to feel stable, superior, or relevant. There's no announcement, no post, no dramatic farewell, just the quiet unfolding of someone who decided to stop shrinking for the comfort of others. You begin to wear your calm like armor. You stop explaining why you said no. Why didn't you attend? Why do you no longer engage in the same conversations? You're still kind, but you no longer overextend. You still care, but not at the expense of your peace. And for the first time, you realize you never needed their permission to live differently. When they reach out, they're not always checking in out of love. Sometimes they're checking in to measure how much of you they still have access to. But your silence, your subtle shifts, your quiet boundaries, they tell them what they need to know. You're no longer available in the ways you used to be. And that unspoken truth is more disruptive to the ego than any direct confrontation, because now they don't know where they stand. They don't know how to get a reaction. They don't know how to reach you, not because you're hiding, but because you're simply not playing the game anymore. True emotional growth isn't loud. It doesn't chase closure. It doesn't beg to be acknowledged. It knows that being grounded in self-respect means you no longer need to prove you've changed. The proof is in your presence, or rather, in your absence. You begin to walk differently, speak differently, respond differently. Not for others to notice, but because your healing has reshaped you. And while they look for signs of who you used to be, you're already 3 steps into becoming someone else entirely. Not someone new, but someone finally whole. They may scroll through your profile hoping for signs. They may reread old messages, trying to find the version of you that once sought their validation. But that version no longer answers. That version has been replaced by someone who chooses peace over performance, clarity over chaos, self-worth over explanation. Your silence becomes the strongest signal you could ever send, not to them, but to yourself. Because at some point, you stop needing applause for every step forward. You stop needing to explain why you chose stillness, solitude, or separation. And when that moment arrives, You don't announce it. You live it. You let the silence do what words never could. You let it speak for your growth, your healing, your freedom. And in that silence, everything changes. 5. Turn your absence into their wake-up call. There are people who never truly see what you do until you stop doing it. They don't notice the reminders, the small efforts, the quiet emotional labor that keeps things running smoothly. You become part of the background, not because you lack value, but because they've grown used to your presence, absorbing the chaos, covering the cracks, softening the edges of their disorganization. And when someone like that finally experiences your absence, not through an argument, but through quiet detachment, something unsettling happens. They start to feel the weight of everything you used to carry, and for the first time, they're left standing on ground they always assumed you'd keep sweeping beneath them. Take something as simple as living with a roommate. You've been the one who reminds them to pay the rent on time, who notices when the trash is full, who restocks the essentials without ever being asked. It's not thanked, it's expected. Over time, your care becomes invisible. But one day you stop reminding. You pay your share and move on. You no longer chase, no longer clean up after them emotionally or practically. And when they get a late fee, when something slips through the cracks, they pause. Not because of what you said, but because of what you didn't. No guilt trip, no lecture, just the vacuum of your absence. And that absence echoes. When you remove yourself from the equation, you remove the emotional safety net they didn't even realize they were leaning on. And what's left is the raw reality they avoided facing. How much you actually did, how much you actually mattered. You never needed to raise your voice for them to feel it. You just needed to stop showing up in the ways they always assumed you would. That's what makes silence so powerful. It's not about punishment, it's about perspective. It's not revenge, it's a reset. They might reach out, they might send a casual text or drop a line masked as concern. Everything okay? What they're really saying is, I feel the shift, and I don't know what to do with it. But you don't owe them a breakdown of your absence. You don't owe them a roadmap back to your emotional availability. Because when you were present, fully, completely, they didn't take the time to see it. And now that you're gone, they can't stop feeling it. You never disappear to prove a point. You disappear because you finally realize the pointlessness of staying where you aren't valued. You stop reminding. You stop reaching out. You stop keeping things together behind the scenes. And they begin to understand the cost of your silence, not because you made it dramatic, but because you made it real. Ego-driven people often don't wake up when you cry, argue, or plead. They wake up when you go quiet. When your side of the conversation stops. When your energy is no longer available. They refresh your messages. They watch your online status. They look for clues in the silence you've left behind. But there's nothing to decode, because the message was never meant to be loud. It was meant to be felt. You can't teach people to value what they take for granted, but you can show them the truth by removing it. That's the power of absence. It's a mirror. It forces them to confront the role you played without the comfort of having you play it again. It's emotional detachment, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. You finally see that your energy is sacred, and anyone who repeatedly fails to honor it doesn't deserve access to it. This is not about being unkind, it's about choosing yourself in silence. You're not slamming doors, you're simply no longer holding them open. And in that stillness, they begin to understand what your presence used to protect them from themselves. Let them sit in it, let them notice. Because of that discomfort they now feel, that's not your burden anymore. That's the weight of their own neglect finally landing in their hands. In the end, your absence speaks louder than any argument. It teaches, it humbles, and it clarifies. And as they come to terms with everything they lost without a single goodbye, you'll already be walking forward, lighter, clearer, free. Not because they finally saw your value, but because you did. And you decided that was enough. 6. Rewrite the story. You're no longer the one who chases. There comes a moment when your silence doesn't just speak, it rewrites history. The version of you that used to explain, apologize, chase, and hold everything together starts to fade. Not with drama, but with calm. And what replaces it is someone unrecognizable to those who always expected you to return, to forgive, to be emotionally available, no matter how one-sided it had become. For a long time, they thought they knew how the story would go. They'd disappear, take what they needed, and come back when it was convenient. And you? You would respond, help, support, and pick up where things left off, like nothing ever happened. But not this time. This time you're not angry. You're done. You've stopped participating in the emotional pattern that always left you drained and unheard. You didn't respond, not because you wanted to punish, but because you finally understood that continuing would mean betraying yourself. Think of that friend who only ever messaged you when their life was falling apart. You were their go-to when they needed to cry, vent, or escape. But when your world got heavy, they were nowhere. Still, you kept answering, kept giving, until one day the message comes, "Hey, can we talk?" And this time, you just breathe and let it sit. You don't delete it. You don't rage about it. You simply choose not to respond. Not because you're holding a grudge, but because you've realized that emotional reciprocity doesn't live here. You're not their therapist. You're not their emergency contact. You're not their temporary fix for permanent habits. You've outgrown that story. And by not chasing, you've rewritten your place in it. They notice. Don't doubt that. When the pattern breaks, they feel it immediately. They expect the usual cycle, your soft heart stepping in to mend what they broke. But this time, all they get is silence. That absence, it's not just confusing to them, it's terrifying. Because their ego counted on your predictability. It was a quiet agreement that no matter what happened, you would always come back. Your silence destroys that illusion. It forces them to question everything they assumed about you and about themselves. When you no longer react, you become unreadable to those who used to control the narrative. They scroll through your past messages looking for clues. They replay old conversations, trying to figure out what changed. And the truth is, you did. You changed quietly. You healed in silence. You learned that not everyone deserves your explanation. And you discovered that walking away doesn't require an announcement. It only requires a decision. Your lack of response isn't about power games. It's about peace. You're not choosing silence to manipulate. You're choosing it to protect. Because chasing after people who only remember you when they're falling apart is not connection. It's self-abandonment. And you're not doing that anymore. You've stopped trying to earn a place in someone's life by proving your worth. You've stopped justifying your presence. You've stopped showing up for people who never once showed up for you. This kind of transformation doesn't need permission. It doesn't wait to be understood, it just unfolds. And in its unfolding, it shifts every dynamic you were once trapped in. You become someone who no longer feeds toxic cycles. Someone who no longer gives away energy just to feel needed. And as your silence deepens, they are left alone with the story they wrote about you. And now it no longer fits. They thought you were dependent. They thought you'd always need to be heard, always need to be seen. But you no longer chase that validation. You've learned that your emotional peace matters more than being misunderstood. And while they wait for your return, you're already somewhere else, living, growing, becoming someone who finally understands that being chosen should never require constant proving. You don't need to confront them. You don't need to explain why you went quiet. Your silence is the explanation. It says you've stopped performing. You've stopped playing the role they created. And by stepping off that stage, you've left them without a script. Now they're not just missing your words, they're missing your presence. Your calm detachment reveals what your words never could, that the version of you they depended on has evolved into someone they can no longer access. That is the power of not chasing. It's not rejection, it's redirection. You're no longer pleading to be understood, you're choosing to be at peace. And that silence, it's not empty, it's full of all the healing, clarity, and self-respect they never expected you to reach. But now that you have, the story has changed, and it's no longer one they get to write. 7. Silence isn't distance. It's a decision. There is a kind of silence that doesn't come from conflict or coldness or cruelty. It comes from clarity. You don't choose it because you stopped caring. You choose it because you finally started caring about your mental clarity, your emotional grounding, and your peace. Silence isn't always a wall you build to shut others out. Sometimes it's a boundary you place to let yourself in. You don't go quiet by accident. It's never that simple. It's a conscious choice to no longer let the noise around you dictate your worth. To no longer participate in conversations that reopen wounds you've worked hard to heal. And though others might interpret your silence as distance, it's not about them. It's about what you need to stay whole. You know the pattern. Every phone call with your sibling starts normally, but ends in the same place. Old mistakes, past arguments, memories covered in guilt and regret. You apologize again, even though you've apologized before. You explain again, even though your reasons haven't changed. And after each call, you feel drained. Not because you don't love them, but because you keep shrinking to fit their version of who you used to be. And one day, you stop. You don't block them. You don't fight. You simply don't engage. You don't answer every call. You don't explain why. You just give yourself the space you once believed you didn't deserve. That silence isn't rejection. It's protection. Not from them, but from the version of you who thought guilt was a requirement for love. People often confuse silence with disconnection. They think if you don't speak, you don't care. But what they don't see is how much effort it took to arrive at that stillness. They don't understand that silence can be the final step in your emotional self-respect, that choosing not to react is harder than any confrontation. Because staying silent when you could defend yourself, when you could make your case, takes strength, it takes restraint, and more importantly, it takes deep awareness of what truly deserves your voice. When you stop engaging, it isn't a withdrawal from love, it's a withdrawal from pain. You're not turning away from people, you're turning toward yourself. You're choosing not to relive cycles that pull you back into emotional chaos. You're choosing stillness over reaction and emotional detachment over unnecessary suffering. And in doing so, you begin to rebuild something sacred, your sense of inner safety. Because silence doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes it means presence in your own life, in your own space, without interruption. The ego-driven response to your silence is predictable. They'll say you've changed, that you're cold now, that you've shut everyone out. But deep down, even they know the truth. You've stopped over-explaining your boundaries. You've stopped trying to fix what you never tried to understand. You've stopped being emotionally available to conversations that never evolved. And that shift makes people uncomfortable. Not because you've hurt them, but because your peace exposes their noise. This is the moment when silence becomes your strategy, your self-defense, your emotional filter. You no longer let everything in. You no longer feel guilty for choosing yourself. You no longer respond just because someone is speaking. And that decision, though quiet, changes everything. Because silence is not passive. It's active. It's a choice. And in a world that constantly demands you explain yourself, justify your choices, and prove your worth, choosing silence is one of the most powerful declarations of self-worth you can ever make. There's a deeper beauty in being the one who walks away with grace. You didn't slam the door. You didn't burn the bridge. You simply stopped crossing it. You stopped giving them access to the part of you that never stopped giving, even when it hurt. And now your silence speaks louder than any goodbye. It tells a different story, not one of bitterness, but of transformation. You're not silent because you're lost. You're silent because you've finally been found by yourself. So let them interpret it however they want. Let them wonder. Let them tell themselves the version that makes them feel better. But you'll know the truth. Your silence isn't distance. It's a decision. A decision to stop carrying what was never yours. A decision to heal in peace instead of explaining in pain. A decision to no longer be the one who bends to stay connected. Because now you choose connection to yourself above all else. And that's not distance. That's home. Silence is not weakness. It is not avoidance. It is a conscious, powerful decision to reclaim your peace, protect your emotional energy, and rewrite your story on your own terms. In a world that pressures you to react, to explain, to justify, choosing silence becomes the most potent form of emotional control. When you no longer feed toxic egos, chase validation, or explain your worth, You break free. You stop being emotionally drained by people who only value your reactions. You step into quiet confidence, emotional detachment, and inner peace. That is not distance, it is self-respect. Each time you hold back a reaction, you build resilience. Each time you choose stillness, you grow stronger. You are not disappearing, you are becoming untouchable in the best way. And those who once underestimated your silence will eventually feel the power of your absence. If this message resonates with you, take a moment to share your experience in the comments below. When did silence change everything for you? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more content on stoic emotional strength, calm mindset training, and how to stop reacting emotionally. Your story may be the mirror someone else needs to finally choose themselves.